Hi, everybody. My name is Ilongo Charan. I'm on the Google internationalization team, and I'll be talking to you today about fixing input methods for Abugida scripts. So there are three big ideas I want to talk to you about. One is that there is a problem and that it affects many people. This affects people who speak South Asian and Southeast Asian languages, and this affects 1.5 billion people. This is also a problem for companies. So if you're in a company that, I don't know, you can think of some that care about search and AI or chatting and social media, then your company probably cares about these issues too. You are dependent on these things working well. And that there's a simple idea to fix these problems. So today I want to first identify the problem and give you a little background so that you can understand it. Then I'll show you a solution and talk about the feedback I've gotten from it. And then we can talk about taking it further. Since the first word of this talk is fixing, it does imply that there is a problem. So first, let's define what that problem is. And also what I've noticed is that if you're unfamiliar with South Asian or Southeast Asian languages, then you may not quite understand it. And if you don't understand it, then you may not even believe that such a problem exists. So let's define some of this jargon here. As far as an input method, let's think of it as virtual keyboards that you would use on a phone or a computer to type languages. Traditional physical keyboards imply that you type a key and you get a shape coming out. But software can allow you to do more clever things, and that's useful, very useful for a lot of languages. Script means the way that you write words down. So multiple languages might share a script, but they might pronounce things differently or have slight variations. You all know how alphabetic scripts work. Here we're talking about Abugida scripts, and the best way to explain how they work is just to show them. In an Abugida, we have vowels and we have consonants, and we draw things around the consonants to indicate whether there's a vowel sound and what it is. So we have these letters ik, ka, ke, ko. And here's the shape that represents the consonant, the K sound, in all these letters. And then here are the things that we draw around it to indicate whether there's a vowel sound. One thing to point out is that Abugidas are not perfectly consistent because a shape doesn't necessarily correspond to a sound or vice versa. In this case, sure, the base shape has an implicit short A sound. So that also means to get the pure consonant, one without the short A sound, you actually have to have a symbol, usually some type of small circle or semicircle or stroke to indicate that this is a pure consonant, there's no vowel. Okay, so let's take a look at what the current keyboards do. So this is Gboard. And here, this is typing Varnakam. Okay, so what did we just see? So, first of all, Gboard is Google's keyboard. And it's great. It supports hundreds and hundreds of languages, including many minority languages and endangered languages. It's great. But here's how it behaves with index scripts. The keycaps are all Unicode characters. So we're talking about the consonants and the vowels and the combining marks. The key press, when you press a consonant key, then the vowel keys flicker. And they flicker in a way in which the vowel then becomes that consonant plus the vowel combination. In this keyboard, you didn't see the language Tamil does not have consonant conjuncts, but pretty much all other index scripts do. And to get those, you have to do a long press. You have to press and hold. And that's not great. But let's just take another look at this again so that we can notice some of this in action. So the vowels are on the left-hand side, and notice what's happening every time a consonant's being pressed. So let's take a look at some of the feedback I've gotten from people in the community when I've asked them about this. I say, do you use the keyboard? And they say, well, one person said, I type Tamil using English with transliteration. It's easier. And this is not an uncommon thing. I've heard this a lot, in fact. The point that they're not typing the language using the language itself should stick out in your mind. And it's easier, which says, yes, something's broken here. One person said, sure, the keyboard works and it kind of works the way that you would write. I don't like it completely and I don't know why. So what are the stakes of this problem? So if your language doesn't have a keyboard, you're obviously disadvantaged. And previously, we had plenty of minority languages. We also had languages like Osage and Fulfulde that didn't have a keyboard, but a lot of major languages did have keyboards. So clearly those languages like Osage Fulfulde, minority languages, were disadvantaged. And it was a huge help once they did get keyboards. So they're fine, we're all fine, right? And that's the end of the story. Keyboards are done, everyone's happy. Now, what if a keyboard is hard to use? What does that mean? You know, it's not as bad as not having a keyboard, but that's still a problem. And my assertion is that we can do a lot better with these South Asian and Southeast Asian keyboards. Because if you can't type, you're basically a passive consumer of content. You can't write and send emails. You can't write chat messages. You can't post your helpful, insightful comments on social media. You can't do any of that stuff. You just have to read the beautiful stuff from other people. But let's also take a step back and look at the bigger picture here. So in the early days of the internet, users created pages, they uploaded them, and that was it. As the collection of web pages increased, then you had things like search engines to make sense of this. And those web pages were the input to the search engines. As that collection grew, it became really valuable to have these types of search engines. And the value of those grew as the size of the content increased. Okay, now let's fast forward to today. We're talking about AI and large language models, which I'm representing as magic sparkles, right? And I think of it as the same idea, though, that these new applications are only as good as the content that you feed it as input. And if you don't have as much input, for whatever reason, people are not able to write, you don't have as much content, and with less content, the value and the quality of these applications is also diminished. So this was very timely. This article came out within the last week, and it's about a startup that is hand curating Indic language input data for training AI models. Here are some quotes. It says, many AI services developed with English language internet data poorly represent the diversity of languages. And users are accessing AI-powered smartphones and apps faster than they're learning English. Hopefully that's not news to you. It's definitely not news to me. Nearly 1 billion such potential users live in India alone. This article was written only in the last week, but India has 1.4 billion people. Bangladesh, they also have another 170 million. So this is underselling it. For South Asian languages, some large language models have been found to make up words and struggle with basic grammar, and they reflect a more skewed view of other cultures. So that sounds like a problem to me. But the point is, you can't have your wonderful pixie dust coded sparkly applications unless you have the content that they depend on. And that content depends on people creating it, inputting it in. fixing the problem. So I want to talk about consonants and vowels of the language. And so the language Tamil that I showed you before, when you have a first grade textbook, you're learning how to read, this is the chart of the alphabet. This is just one section of it. And you have the vowels on the top, and you have the consonants on the side, and all the other letters are just a combination of a consonant and a vowel. And that's the grid. It's pretty straightforward. So consonant vowel gets you another letter. And this is how language, like native language speakers will think about the language. Without going into too many details, there's a big difference in how these users think and how Unicode represents things and thinks about them. Of course, the keyboard I showed you before chose the easiest path to implement, and it works based on the Unicode encoding paradigm, and that's not the way that users think. And we saw, based on the user feedback, that it has room to improve in order to meet those needs. So I'm going to talk about phonemes, which is just my shorthand way of just saying it's the set of sounds, the consonants and vowels of the language. And so here is an implementation based on that. Okay, so I implemented this using Keyman, produced by SIL, and they've done a lot of great work over the last decades, and I really appreciate that. This is what I typed into the phoneme keyboard. It's just a lot simpler for users visually and logically. And the keyboard implementation handles the rules produced to produce those correctly encoded shapes. And this is similar to how the Korean keyboard already works. Let's just take another look at it again.
Can you comment on what we're seeing? It's a little bit hard to understand what is really going on.
Yeah, so the left-hand side of the keyboard are the vowels. The right-hand side are the consonants. You can recognize the pure consonants because they have a dot on top that indicate that there's no vowel sound. And we're typing vanakkam, which is the formal word for, like hello, goodbye, formal greeting. But as this next slide showed, we're doing it through the consonants. And in the same way that when you decompose Korean text into the jamos, and it sort of serves like an alphabet, that's kind of what the phonemes do for these Abugida scripts. And it really is an important point, not just for keyboard design, but for other applications as well.
You type the letter with the vowel, and then you add a sound to it to make vowel.
Yeah, so the question is, when you type the consonant, like you're typing the pure consonant, which is the shape with the pulli, the dot on top, and that's correct. That's actually the pure consonant. That is strictly the letter V sound.
But with my Unicode brain, I'm thinking the other way around, right? So,
Your Unicode brain's thinking the other way around, and
right, okay.
yes, exactly. I want to disabuse you of those thoughts here. I want you to be very user-centric, and maybe just me as the user think about how I'm thinking about it. Yeah, great. No, I appreciate that, because I think this discrepancy is not uncommon among internationalization people. I've seen it time and time again.
Is that actually what works? Is it? I'm understanding what you're doing, but is that actually what people prefer, or what a lot of people prefer then?
Is this what people prefer? Good
Yeah.
question. Let's see what people think.
I mean,
Good segue.
What Tamil.
I have more slides.
Okay.
What users say. Next slide. This is a good improvement. Keep it up. If you've attended Unicode conferences before, you may know Muthu Nedamaran. He's presented a few times. He's basically, since the late 80s, taken every operating system he can get his hands on and has implemented the Thumbl font and a keyboard for it. It's like the same stuff. It's a good font. This is what he said. He designed the iOS Thumbl keyboard and the Mac OS keyboard and the font for that. Yeah, so I showed this to him recently. This is what other users said. These are just community members. This is, this person says, this is faster than Gboard. Now, the other phrases to me are very telling. I only have to know something. I don't have to remember how to. And those phrases to me are telltale signs of simple design. When you don't have to think about stuff, when the responsibility, the complexity gets offloaded off of the human and onto the computer, that's what we want. That's good design. And I see that here in this comment. Another person said, this is faster than the iOS keyboard. Because in the iOS keyboard doesn't always add the pulli, the dot that indicates the pure consonant. Doesn't always add the pulli where it needs to be, which is confusing. Again, the word confusing, the opposite of simple, consistent design. They have to think about this. This is my favorite quote. I showed it to one person. He was very animated. He said, this is how I expected that the Thumbl keyboard would work. And then he got his phone, didn't. He said, I was disappointed. There was no other option, so I started using what exists. And it shows to me a couple things. It shows a rare, precise awareness from a user of the problem. But I think it also shows something else. I think it reveals a bias in how we collectively are seeing this problem, or as I said, overlooking this problem. Because just like with anything, you only get what you measure, right? Whether it's election polling or it's computer benchmarking, however you design that, that's what you're going to get. And, you know, a lot of attention has been given in the last few years to voice input, because voice input was trendy, right? Voice assistants and whatnot. And some of the argumentation was, well, in India, the literacy rates aren't that great. So maybe it's a literacy problem. Maybe what we really need to be doing is looking at that and solving for voice and seeing what people say about that. But I think that's problematic because, as this quote shows, there is a latent desire for better typing. It just didn't exist. And if we're not looking for it, if we don't realize that it exists, that there's a problem, we're not solving it. I mean, I can just imagine being on a crowded bus and not wanting or not being able to scream into a voice assistant. There's a crowded bus in India, and not scream into a voice assistant and wanting to have all your personal conversation available there. You know, there's room for this. I also think that potentially, if you have a simpler model for typing in that language, maybe learning the irregularities of the script actually becomes easier, because you can just say, what happens when I take this consonant and combine it with that consonant and that vowel, and you'll get the right answer. Maybe that's a tool for teaching and learning. So maybe it's the reverse. Maybe if you build it, people will become literate, but you're not going to find that if you just assume it's a lost cause. One thing that we haven't talked about much is backspace in terms of keyboard. Our general expectation with alphabetic scripts is that when you hit backspace, it's kind of like you undo the last thing that was typed. I want to show that that was thought about for this implementation. So I'm backspacing on the word that you see. So this works just like the phoneme keyboard input, but in reverse. And if this is unremarkable, that's the point. That's good. You didn't see any flickering. You just saw a backspace, and that's great. Because user experiences should be predictable and boring. They should not be surprising and confusing. But when we look at the current keyboard implementation's backspace problems, usually it removes code points. Again, that's the Unicode way of thinking about it. Sometimes it removes the entire letter, or to be more accurate, it's the grapheme cluster, or both. It depending on the direction. If you delete backwards, it's one thing. If you delete forwards, it's with the delete key, it's another thing. And overall, it's just not consistent, and it's definitely not standardized. No one's talking about it. What does it look like on Gboard to backspace? Okay, so we're deleting shapes, we're going back. And so notice how we were deleting the shapes, but also if you, let's just take one more look at this. And notice the flickering that's happening every time we delete a character. Okay, so future work. Based on what I know, and I'm not a script expert or a language expert, so, you know, definitely don't come at me if I get things wrong. I'm trying my best, but from what I understand, the basic phonology of the languages of Southern Indic languages, Tamil, Malayalam, Telugu, Kannada, and Sinhala, they all have that sort of tabular style. They have a consonant and a vowel gets you another letter in a very mathematical way. So I think that this idea should adapt fairly well. The other scripts will have consonant conjuncts, but that's fine because that's, you offload that complexity. You write the right rules, offload that to the machine. So what I do want to do is I want to implement something like this for Malayalam next and prove out the idea. We go from there. I think I want this idea to expand further. I think other scripts that are Abugidas, it will take some research. Maybe it won't 100% extend, but I think that there's still opportunity to improve the experience in how we type those scripts and languages. So for what I'm calling North Indic scripts, so we have Devanagari, which is used for Hindi and other things, Bangla, Marathi. Manish is definitely pointing out to me, schwa deletion is a thing. So for those scripts, you don't always pronounce it the way it's written. So much for like math being, 2 + 2 is 4. It's like, it's not perfect. However, there are a lot of consonant conjuncts, and I still think that there's a lot of room for that because there's a lot of problems when you encode those types of consonant conjuncts, especially as they get more complicated. You see a lot of questions about that, and they really shouldn't be typing code points or the equivalent of code points through their input method. Southeast Asian languages are related, and Ethiopic languages are also Abugidas. I don't know enough about them. I don't know how regular those are. So whether or not this extends to those is sort of like, that definitely needs a lot more research, and especially someone who takes the time to understand it well. So I'm less sure about any of that. But we have people making new keyboards, new keyboard makers, and we have news from people who are doing that stuff. So Translation Commons has launched a new keyboard initiative, which I know people in the room can speak to better than me. But that's really great because that's about trying to make keyboards for languages that don't have them. Maybe they're endangered, they're minority languages. The CLDR subcommittee on keyboards should be coming out with a spec soon, in the course of a few months. And Keyman by SIL, which is the program that I was showing you before to make the keyboard, they're going to try to support that new spec in a way that allows, and what that means is that with that new spec, you can actually write the rules to do the transformations, and then Keyman will be able to implement those rules. So that will make making such keyboards a lot easier. All right, so to recap, we have big ideas here. It's a problem for many users. Your company probably cares, and there's a simple way to fix this. And oops. So yeah, so what we can do to address that is to educate and advocate. The fact that you are here and you're learning about this is is wonderful, and I hope you can share this information and explain these issues to people who have questions. If you work in a company that cares, helping that company realize that they need content and they need these problems to be solved, and that they might have a role in fixing this. And it's a simple idea, so we just got to create better keyboards now. Here's my information. Here's where you can find me on the interwebs. That's how you can email me. How are we doing for time, and do we have time for questions?
Yeah, we have a time for a few questions.
Great.
First, let's give Longo a round of applause. I know I heard a lot of muttering over here, so let's get some questions. Tex.
It was all good stuff, I'm sure. So I want to lobby for the unconference tomorrow. I was thinking part of what Longo brought to the table is there may be some principles for design of keyboards and how keys are laid out. I'm working on digitizing indigenous language keyboards, and it's not always obvious what the best layout is, where you put the characters and why, and how hard it is to type with certain finger positions and how frequent characters are used. So I was thinking tomorrow at the unconference, whether or not there might be a way to use AI in order to create a draft layout for the next languages, applying some of these principles, maybe some of the ideas that Longo has, and see if we can't create a strategy for not quite automating keyboards, but getting first drafts for some of these languages that don't have keyboards, or could benefit from an improved layout as Longo had done. So if you're around tomorrow at the unconference, let's see if we can't have that discussion.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I just want to make a point here, which I think is subtle but important. The layout is what we tend to talk about when we talk about the arrangement of keys. I think the salient point here, if there is just a single one, maybe there's a few. The important point isn't the layout of the keys. It's the behavior of how these things combine.
It's the choice.
Yeah, and it's specific to the layout. What's interesting is I had originally designed a layout that I thought would be maximally efficient for a desktop keyboard, and so then I thought, well, QWERTY, we use QWERTY keyboard, and then we have the QWERTY on the phone, even though we don't need to. So I had like my Dvorak style, whatever, I divined it, and then I showed it to somebody, and they're like, I can't find the keys, and they wish it was in alphabetical order. So I just put in a sort of alphabetical order, vowels on the left, consonants on the right. Yeah.
I have a question. One thing I noticed from the keyboard layout that you showed second was, I wonder if it would, which layout works better with swipe keyboard entry, which is what I like to use. It seems like if you're going consonant, vowel, that's easier to swipe than if you have to go like consonant, diacritic. Yeah,
actually, I don't know if I can find the slide, but when I was typing Vanakkam and there was a K duplicated, that actually happens a lot. Is that called gemination for the language nerds out here? Yes, thumbs up. So that happens a lot in Thumber. And you lose that ability with what we have currently, and you gain that ability to double tap with this phoneme style. So that's actually really important. I'm glad you pointed that out. Oh, and Shane, okay.
I just wanted to say that I'm using a Japanese keyboard almost daily, or a Japanese input method, and these are used widely. I mean, there's no discussion anymore much about, well, what could be a better keyboard or a better way to do the input or so. Maybe there is, but that's not. It's not that the users complain, as far as I understand. But when looking at this, that you use a phonetic input, that's very much also what the Japanese use. So there might be an underlying kind of just general principle that phonetic input type, the way you speak, kind of, is something that people can work with, that they prefer.
Yeah, I've thought about that, like with the hiragana and the katakana, but they're syllabaries. Abugidas get called alpha syllabaries because once you decompose them into the phonemes, they kind of they behave like an alphabet. But syllabaries aren't quite like that. So I think
so the Japanese use Latin letters to get over that. So
okay.
most type Latin letters, and then you see the kana in the first step, and then of course you have the ideographs as a second step. But I also thought, well, if people complain that they can not type it, how can they read it? But then I was thinking, well, I also prefer to just type the way I speak Japanese. I still can read the kanji in their own screen. So
We have time for about 2 more questions.
Oh, so Shane, there's a question in the back first.
I was responding to him
Oh, okay.
a little bit. I do want to point out that a major difference between Japanese and Tamil and other Indic languages here is because I do think that the point is relevant, that people might use Latin just because QWERTY keyboards are taught. Like I also have I use a Marathi keyboard, and I use both a Latin, I both transcribe and use a Marathi keyboard, and I have to find the keys sometimes just because I'm not as used to it, whereas here I just do it. But at the same time, and that's nothing to do with the keyboard quality, that's just I'm not used to it. But Japanese, there is a very clear one-to-one Latin mapping, whereas on most Indic languages, you'll type a T and that can mean like one of 2 or 4 things. And now your predictive text is overloaded with, like you make, in English, when I make one misspelling, the spell checker gets me. In Marathi, I make one misspelling. It's already spending too much time dealing with the ambiguities. So the misspelling, it's out now. Like, I gotta be right.
If any more questions, do you have time for 1 or 2 more questions? Anything in the back? Nope. There's a question.
How does it work? What did you change? How complicated are the rule sets that you're using to manage this change in the way you're doing things?
It's not that complicated. So Keyman has a bunch of transformations. So all I had to do was I basically wrote a script or a small tiny program, and I just auto-generated the rule strings and then stuck them in a rule and then clicked compile, and that was it. So I needed to generate the rules that said, if you see the ik, and then someone types the key that corresponds to the E sound, and turn that into a key. And then Keyman has the ability to do the transformation of the text accordingly. And then I did the same thing with the backspace. So I say, if you see a key that was previous in the context and you backspace, then just get the ik, or just remove the vowel sound. And so I just wrote a little script to auto-generate it. It wasn't hard.
We have time for 1 more question.
Where's Bob? Speaking of people in my organization who have the power to affect change.
Okay, I guess one thing I can say here is someone brought up maybe we can have like an unconference to talk about topics like this. If you think that's a good idea, make sure it's on the whiteboard over there. Manish is showing us like where the whiteboard is. So make sure that it's written on a sticky note there, and you can vote for it. And not just for this topic, but also for any other topics, then maybe things that you were inspired to think about based on some of the sessions earlier in the day. Right on sticky notes over there. That whiteboard will be here tomorrow, and then we'll go through those topics tomorrow afternoon. So this is a good time to maybe think about that and leave up some sticky notes. And with that, I think we're just about out of time. So why don't we give Alongo another nice round of applause? And we have one session left today.